Our second lesson this morning comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 1 through 14. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' The Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone so that my wrath may burn hot against them and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation.' But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath. Change your mind and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven. And all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A few years ago, during the back-to-school season, the New York Times reported some surprising research on test taking. It turns out that tests aren't just a way of assessing how well a student has learned certain material. They are also a powerful tool for helping students retain what they've learned. When you sit down to a test that challenges you and makes you think, all of that information gets anchored more deeply in your mind, and you have a better chance of recalling it later, long after the test is over. Apparently, tests are not just meant to torture us. They are some of the best tools we have for learning. Not long after the Israelites escaped their life of slavery in Egypt, their leader, Moses, receives the 10 Commandments from God, rules to guide this new community in their life together. But apparently, God has a few other things to talk to Moses about, so shortly after Moses gives the people the commandments, he disappears again up Mount Sinai, leaving the Israelites waiting and waiting and waiting for his return. When Moses leaves, the Israelites face a test for which they feel woefully unprepared. Without Moses, they begin to think that maybe God isn't with them anymore. Maybe God has in fact abandoned them. And as soon as they start thinking that they might be lost, they forget the first of the commandments God gave them. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And they gather up all their gold, melt it down, and create a shiny statue to worship. It's an understandable mistake. The Israelites were a people at the beginning of what would be a long journey through the wilderness, longer, surely, than any of them could imagine at that point. Their present and their future are filled with uncertainty. They aren't really sure yet of this new identity as God's chosen people, and they aren't yet convinced that life with God is really going to be better than a life of servitude in Egypt. We may not have been in the Israelites' exact situation, but we know a lot about uncertainty. We know how it feels to thirst for answers to the questions that confound us. We don't have to sleep in makeshift tents in the wilderness to lie awake at night, worrying about violence, about poverty, about all of the ways we human beings have found to divide ourselves from one another. Our uncertainty may not lead us to pool our gold and create a statue, but when we get lost, we have devised plenty of other ways to fashion idols. Sometimes we do it by substituting something else for God, usually something that makes us feel good, at least for a little while. Money, food, alcohol, work are a few of these things. The other way we create idols is more subtle, but no less dangerous. We make God into something God is not. Often something that looks like what we want God to look like, one who protects us from suffering and gives us clear answers to all of our questions. Sometimes we think that God is in a person, whether that person is a mentor or a teacher or a politician. Sometimes we associate God too closely with a beloved tradition, sometimes a tradition in the church, like a particular style of worship or type of music. No matter how we do it, though, the outcome is clear. We distort God's image and begin to worship something that is not God. When I was 12, my 6th grade class participated in an exchange with an elementary school in London, England, and we had the opportunity to travel there for 3 weeks. One day, 13 of us, 2 teachers and 11 students, set out to go sightseeing, which involved riding the subway, or the tube as they call it. We waited for a few minutes on a crowded platform, and when the train finally arrived, we pushed ourselves on with the teachers bringing up the rear. But when only half of our group was on, the train car simply ran out of room. And before the rest of the students and the teachers could get on, the doors began to close. For a moment, as the train pulled away, we were terrified and our teachers were panic-stricken. Then one of them began frantically shouting, "Get off at the next stop! Get off at the next stop!" So we did. We got off and we waited for the rest of the group to catch up, which they did within minutes. For years, though, I kept a framed picture that I took on the subway platform of my friends as we were waiting. They lounged on a bench with goofy expressions on their faces, which clearly show the delicious sense of freedom we felt as we waited for our teachers to catch up to us. Fear was the furthest thing from our minds. We knew they would find us, and we had no doubt that all would be well. At this point in their story, the Israelites have not cemented this knowledge. They have not learned to trust that whether they can see, feel, or sense God, God is with them. It's a difficult lesson for all of us. We all tend to revert to our fears when facing seasons of confusion or doubt or suffering. And at that time, it is incredibly tempting to make God into something we can handle, something that makes sense, something that is predictable, and that we do not have to fear. But with that very first commandment, God does not promise us safety or security, understanding or predictability. God simply promises to be our God, always, in every circumstance, to find us and be for us and with us. When God sees how spectacularly the Israelites have failed to understand the commandments, God is furious. But God's love for the Israelites overcomes God's anger. God refuses to let them stay lost in their fear and uncertainty, refuses to abandon the people, and instead commits to doing whatever it takes to find them, no matter how lost they are. This is the God Jesus describes in the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin. Jesus tells these parables because the Pharisees and the scribes are infuriated that he is hanging out with sinners, those they believe to be utterly lost, beyond the pale of God's love and concern. So Jesus asks them a question: which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? If the religious leaders had answered, they would have said, Jesus, none of us would do that. To do so would be to take a huge risk that another sheep would get lost, or worse, eaten by a wolf. No decent shepherd would do that. And Jesus knows that. He knows that not one of the people he's talking to would leave 99 sheep just to find one. They wouldn't. But he knows that God would. God has promised to be our God. God has promised that we are God's people, which means God will find us. In these parables, Jesus does not mean for us to see ourselves as the shepherd or the woman searching for what they have lost. Jesus wants us to know that when we are the ones who are lost, when we are frantically searching for some way to make sense of all the senseless things in life, God is frantically searching for us. And no matter what it takes, no matter how lost we are, no matter how many idols we create in a futile attempt to find comfort and security, God will find us every time. When my friend Rebecca was in college, she frequently walked past an old church on the edge of her campus. One of the paths leading from the university to the main street along campus, the street that had everything from the $5 burrito place to the frat houses to the movie theater to all the major watering holes, that path went right by this little church. As you can imagine, it was a road well traveled. In the middle of this path, the church had placed a sign. It was mostly an invitation to come in, but it ended this way: know that God still cares for this broken world and for all its creatures, and that the cross, even when all else fails, yet makes its appeal. Rebecca read that sign a lot during her 4 years in college. After September 11th, when we went to war with Iraq, on the day her friend's father died suddenly. Recently, yet another senseless tragedy brought the sign to Rebecca's mind, and she emailed the church office to ask if they could tell her exactly what it had said. She was told that the church removed the sign a while back during some construction, and when the work was finished, they didn't put it back up. In the words of the church administrator, some people felt it was awfully gloomy to attract students to come in. It's understandable that some found the sign gloomy. My suspicion, though, is that even for all the students who never crossed the threshold of the church, the sign did something much more important than lift their spirits or spread good cheer. It told the truth, especially to those who felt utterly lost. Know that God still cares for this world and all its creatures, and that the cross, even when all else fails, yet makes its appeal. When the Israelites went to Aaron to ask him to make gods for them, tangible idols for them to worship, they said this, "Make gods for us who shall go before us." They did not know what their future held, and they wanted to know someone was going ahead of them. In the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, God has once and for all done just that, gone ahead of us into whatever gloom or suffering we fear is just around the bend, gone ahead of us to death, gone ahead of us into hell itself. And Jesus has come back to tell us again and again and again that there is nothing in all the world or beyond it that can separate us from God's love, and that God will stop at nothing to make sure that sooner or later we all get found. Amen.